Hi, welcome to Justin's Morning Coffee. Okay, so I did a little experiment today. I started experimenting with AI, and I started to talk with Chat GBT about story structure and about the seven basic plots. And right now, I'm working through the quest archetype. And so I started asking it questions about Moby Dick, and is Moby Dick characterized as a quest story? And I wanted to hear what it had to say. Um, and so I figured I'd present it to you here as if it's an interview with ChatGPT on Moby Dick, and have a listen at our conversation. So the first question I asked was, ChatGPT, uh, what does the character of Queequeg represent in Moby Dick? And here's what he had to say.
According to Booker's archetypal analysis, Queequeg in Moby Dick would be seen as a helper character, specifically the benevolent savage helper. This archetype refers to a character who is initially seen as other, or exotic, by the protagonist or the reader, but who ultimately proves to be a valuable ally and source of wisdom or strength. Queequeg is a cannibal from a different culture than the other characters on the whaling ship, and his initial appearance may be unsettling or even frightening to some of the crew. However, he proves to be a loyal and skilled harpooner, as well as a friend and confidant to Ishmael, the novel's protagonist. Queequeg also has a deep spiritual and philosophical outlook on life, which provides a contrast to Ahab's single-minded pursuit of revenge.
Okay, thank you, ChatGPT, for that. So my next question for you is, could Moby Dick be considered just a straightforward quest archetypal plot, or would you say that it is the dark version, as Christopher Booker does in the Seven Basic Plots, which is this idea that it's a down version, it's a sad version of the quest archetype?
Moby Dick can be seen as the dark version of the quest story because it subverts many of the traditional expectations and outcomes of the quest archetype. In most quest stories, the hero sets out on a journey to accomplish a specific goal or task, and ultimately achieves it, often with the help of various allies and supernatural forces. However, in Moby Dick, Captain Ahab's quest for revenge against the white whale, Moby Dick, is a destructive and ultimately futile obsession that leads to the destruction of his ship and the deaths of many of his crew members. Additionally, the novel challenges the idea that the pursuit of a goal or task is inherently noble or heroic. Ahab's quest for revenge is driven by his personal obsession and desire for power, rather than any larger sense of justice or morality. The novel also questions the idea that humans can truly control or conquer the natural world, represented by the powerful and elusive figure of Moby Dick. Finally, the novel explores darker aspects of human nature, including the themes of madness, obsession, and self-destruction. Ahab's relentless pursuit of Moby Dick leads him to neglect his duty as a captain and risk the lives of his crew, as well as his own sanity and safety.
For hate's sake, I spit my last breath at thee!
The novel suggests that the desire for revenge and the pursuit of power can ultimately lead to destruction and tragedy, rather than heroism and victory.
Wow. Okay. And so how about this? How about this for a question? Would you consider the idea that the white whale in Moby Dick represents God, represents the divine?
While there are certainly symbolic interpretations of the whale in Moby Dick, it is not commonly seen as representing God. The whale is more commonly interpreted as a symbol of nature, the unknown, or the unconscious.
Oh, did you see him, men? You see his hump like a great snow hill.
It represents a force that is beyond human understanding and control, and which is ultimately indifferent to human desires or aspirations. However, it is worth noting that Moby Dick is a complex and multi-layered novel that has been interpreted in many different ways over the years. There are certainly readers and scholars who have seen the whale as representing various spiritual or metaphysical ideas, including God or the devil.
Is it I, God, or who that lifts this arm? But if the great sun cannot move except by God's invisible power, how can my small heart beat unless God does that beating, does that thinking, and all the time, that smiling sky? Look ye into its deeps, and see the everlasting slaughter that goes on. Who put it into its creatures to chase and fang one another? Who's to doom when the judge himself is dragged before the bar?
These interpretations are not necessarily incompatible with other readings of the novel, but they may not be as widely accepted or prominent in contemporary critical discourse. Ultimately, the meaning of the whale in Moby Dick is open to interpretation and depends on the individual reader's perspective and experience.
Okay, interesting. So why is the whale white in Moby Dick?
The color white has many symbolic meanings in Moby Dick, and its significance is explored throughout the novel. One of the most prominent interpretations of the white whale is that it represents a force of nature that is pure and unattainable, but also potentially destructive. The color white is associated with purity, innocence, and transcendence, but it is also a color that can be blinding or overwhelming, especially in large quantities. In the novel, the white whale is portrayed as an almost supernatural figure, with a beauty and power that is beyond human understanding. Captain Ahab becomes obsessed with capturing and killing the whale, seeing it as a symbol of his own personal demons and the ultimate challenge to his power and authority as a captain. Some readers and scholars have also suggested that the white color of the whale may be a reference to the biblical figure of Leviathan, a sea monster that is described in the book of Job as being clothed in scales. His upper parts are like the bars of shields, his eyes are like the eyelids of the dawn. Job 41-15. Leviathan is often interpreted as a symbol of chaos and disorder, and it may be that Melville was drawing on this tradition when he created the character of Moby Dick.
Okay, so in light of what you just said, which is that in the novel, the whale is described as having beauty and power which is beyond human understanding, wouldn't it be then appropriate to interpret the whale as representing God?
It is possible to interpret the whale in Moby Dick as representing the divine, especially given its otherworldly qualities and the reverence with which it is sometimes depicted. However, it is important to note that the novel is not a straightforward allegory or religious parable, and there is no single, definitive interpretation of its meaning or symbolism. In addition, it is worth considering that Melville's own religious views were complex and sometimes ambiguous. While he was raised as a Protestant, he was deeply interested in other religious traditions, including Hinduism and Buddhism, and his writings often explore themes of spirituality, morality, and the human condition from a variety of perspectives. As such, it is difficult to say for certain whether the whale in Moby Dick represents the divine or some other kind of metaphysical or symbolic force.
Okay, interesting. Yes. So, in light of the different religious interests that Melville had in our earlier discussion, why is the narrator in the novel named Ishmael?
The narrator of Moby Dick is named Ishmael, which is a significant choice on Melville's part. Ishmael is a biblical name, and in the Old Testament, Ishmael is the son of Abraham and Hagar. According to the biblical story, Ishmael is cast out into the wilderness by his father and left to fend for himself. There are a few different ways to interpret the significance of this name choice in Moby Dick. One possibility is that Melville intended for Ishmael to represent a kind of outcast or exile figure, someone who is cast out of mainstream society and forced to find his own way in the world. This could be seen as reflecting Melville's own sense of alienation and disillusionment with the society and culture of his time. Another possibility is that Melville intended for Ishmael to embody a kind of spiritual seeker or wanderer, someone who is searching for meaning and purpose in a world that often seems chaotic and senseless. In this interpretation, Ishmael's journey on the Pequod could be seen as a kind of spiritual quest or pilgrimage, as he seeks to come to terms with the mysteries of the natural world and the divine. Overall, the choice of the name Ishmael reflects Melville's interest in exploring the deeper spiritual and existential questions that have preoccupied human beings for centuries, and his belief in the power of storytelling to help us grapple with these profound issues.
Okay, interesting. And reportedly in a letter to Nathaniel Hawthorne, Melville said, I can't exactly remember the quote, something like, I have written an evil book. Do you know about that quote?
Yes, Melville did reportedly say this in a letter to Nathaniel Hawthorne, written in 1851. The full quote is, I have written a wicked book, and feel spotless as the lamb. It's worth noting, however, that Melville's use of the word wicked here doesn't necessarily mean that he believed Moby Dick to be morally corrupt or sinful. Rather, he may have been using the word in a more playful or ironic sense, as a way of acknowledging the novel's unconventional style and subject matter. It's also possible that Melville was expressing a sense of liberation or catharsis in having written such a challenging and boundary-pushing work. Moby Dick was not widely embraced by readers or critics when it was first published, and it's likely that Melville felt a sense of frustration or disappointment with the reception of his work. By referring to the novel as wicked, he may have been expressing a sense of defiance or rebellion against the literary establishment of his time.
Interesting. And so if this is truly the dark version of the quest, what is the value of doing a dark version or a down version or a depressing version of the archetypal story?
The value of dark versions of the quest archetype, such as Moby Dick, lies in their ability to challenge and complicate our understanding of the traditional heroic journey. While the hero's journey is often associated with positive qualities like courage, determination, and self-sacrifice, dark quests like Moby Dick explore the darker, more complex aspects of the human experience, such as obsession, revenge, and existential despair. By subverting our expectations of the hero's journey and exposing us to these more difficult and ambiguous themes, dark quests like Moby Dick force us to grapple with the messier, more complicated aspects of the human condition. They remind us that life is not always straightforward or easy, and that sometimes the most meaningful journeys are the ones that lead us to confront our own limitations and imperfections. In this way, dark quests can be seen as a valuable corrective to overly simplistic or idealized notions of heroism and adventure. They challenge us to think more critically about the stories we tell ourselves about what it means to be a hero, and to embrace the complexity and ambiguity of the human experience.
Hmm. Interesting. Okay. And so, what is the difference between the dark quest, as Booker puts it, and just a straight up tragedy?
According to Booker's framework, the dark version of a story archetype, like Moby Dick for the quest plot, and the tragedy plot type are distinct but related concepts. The tragedy plot type centers on a hero who possesses a tragic flaw that ultimately leads to their downfall. The hero in a tragedy typically experiences a reversal of fortune, often as a result of their own actions, and ultimately meets a tragic end. In contrast, the dark version of a story archetype explores the darker, more complex aspects of the traditional heroic journey, but does not necessarily require the protagonist to meet a tragic end. While dark quests like Moby Dick may be marked by elements of tragedy, such as obsession and despair, the hero's journey in these stories is not necessarily doomed to failure. Another key difference is that tragedies often emphasize the moral dimension of their protagonist's actions and choices, whereas dark quests may be more focused on exploring the psychological and emotional complexities of the hero's journey. In a tragedy, the protagonist's fatal flaw may be seen as a moral failing, while in a dark quest, the hero's flaws and struggles are often more nuanced and psychologically complex. Overall, while the dark version of a story archetype and the tragedy plot type share some similarities, they are distinct in their focus, tone, and ultimate outcome.
Okay, interesting. So, in light of that this is a dark version of the quest, not a tragedy, who is the protagonist? Is it Ishmael, the narrator, or is it Captain Ahab?
While the novel Moby Dick has a complex and multi-layered narrative structure, many scholars and readers consider Captain Ahab to be the protagonist of the story, rather than the narrator Ishmael. Ahab's obsessive quest for revenge against the white whale is the driving force of the novel's plot, and his character arc and ultimate fate is central to the book's themes and meaning. Ishmael, on the other hand, serves primarily as the narrator of the story, and while he undergoes his own personal transformation throughout the book, his journey is secondary to Ahab's quest. That said, it's worth noting that Moby Dick is a complex and multi-layered work, and there is room for interpretation and debate on this question. Some readers might argue that Ishmael's journey and perspective are just as important to the story as Ahab's, or that the novel's true protagonist is the whale itself, rather than any individual character. Ultimately, the answer to this question may depend on one's interpretation of the novel and its themes.
Hmm. Okay, and so why is Ahab so obsessed with the white whale?
Captain Ahab's obsession with the whale is a complex and multifaceted aspect of his character, but one central factor is his desire for revenge. In the novel, Ahab has previously encountered the white whale, who took his leg during a previous voyage. This injury has left Ahab physically and psychologically scarred, and he becomes fixated on the idea of hunting down and killing the whale as a way of avenging himself and proving his own strength and mastery. However, Ahab's obsession with the whale also takes on a deeper, more philosophical dimension over the course of the novel. As he and his crew pursue the whale across the ocean, Ahab becomes increasingly consumed by questions of fate, free will, and the nature of human existence. He sees the whale as a symbol of the universe's indifference to human striving and ambition, and becomes convinced that his quest to destroy the whale is a kind of existential battle against the forces of chaos and meaninglessness.
Wow. Okay. Thank you for having this chat with me, and thank you for doing this interview.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure to have this conversation with you. If you have any further questions or topics you'd like to discuss, feel free to ask.
Okay. So that was my chat with an AI with Chat GBT about the novel Moby Dick. Um, wow. It gives you a lot to think about. Good heavens. I mean, I was absolutely surprised. I was kind of, well, I guess pleasantly surprised. I mean, it had some pretty darn good answers, I thought, and made me think about things about the novel that I wouldn't have necessarily come up with on my own. Um, so I don't know. What do you guys think? Leave a comment. Let me know what you think about AI, and whether or not this conversation brings anything to mind. Anyway, that's it for today. I just wanted to share that little tidbit with you, and I'll be back soon, hopefully soon, with the part one of the quest archetype, which I am hard at work putting together right now.